Welcome to another episode of the podcast. Thanks for tuning in. It's great to have Bill Hartman and Chris Wicus back on the show this week. They were recently on the podcast talking about elasticity, hinge mechanics, and deadlifting. And one of the concepts we didn't get to that I had on the question list was the idea of going into and out of the cut, or expanding on propulsion, and how that understanding of propulsion fits with all human movements, be it sprinting and acceleration and top end speed, throwing, swinging, squatting, and mechanics in the weight room. This was a fantastic, illuminating show. Get your notepad out for this one. It was great having Bill and Chris back on. Let's get on to the show. Bill, Chris, it's awesome to have you guys back on, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today here. Thanks for having us.
Yeah. Glad, excited to get into what we were talking about getting into last time.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, last time, with the whole anytime you're getting into deadlift patterning, or honestly anything, you could go for so long on a single topic. So yeah, we were going to be talking, or one of the things I had was in and out of the cut or change of direction, and how that helps us to better understand everything in this process. And so what I'll ask you guys, just the first question, and I think this. I don't know if I phrased this question too well because it's kind of general, but just talk about the relationship of a cut to the gait cycle. So how does a cut or a change of direction, how is the gait cycle, walking or running, represented in that cut as a starting point that we can dig into later?
So I looked through the notes that you sent me beforehand, and one of the things that stood out is just the nature of that question. I think the best way to probably approach it would be to talk about, because we don't typically, and Bill doesn't typically talk about gait. It's more about propulsion. And when we're talking about the gait cycle related to any type, when we're talking about relating any movement to anything else, we're talking about propulsion, moving through a medium or whatever. So maybe we talk about
do you want to actually give the definition?
Yeah, let's have. I would like to, Bill, if you can define the three phases, and then maybe talk about max P also.
Right.
As one of the phases.
That max P is technically not a phase. Okay, so propulsion is moving forward through space in contact with the medium. And so essentially the reason behind that definition is because it applies to all movement when we are in contact, for instance, with the ground, but it also applies to swimming, and it would also apply to any surface contact that we would have. So we have to follow these specific rules, if you will, to move ourselves forward through space. Doesn't even matter what animal we're talking about; they all have to follow the same rules. So we have phases where we have to absorb energy. We have a phase where we have to actually push straight down into the ground, and which is where we actually come to a stop. So actually time stops, movement stops, and then there is the final storage of energy, and then there's a point right after that where that energy is initially released, and then we have the phase where the energy is being released, and we're again being propelled through space. We're always moving forward. We're just moving forward at different rates, except for that one moment in time, which is so infinitesimally small in most circumstances that we actually stop. So this energy absorbing phase is actually this early phase of propulsion. There's certain things that are happening during that phase, and this is the beginning of the energy storage element of it, and we have to actually acquire a physical shape that allows us to do that. If we were to do this efficiently and effectively, we can do it in other ways, but they tend to be compensatory substitutions. High force conditions require that we have some of these compensatory strategies available to us, but there's always consequences to that. We have the phase where we're reliant on a great deal of this connective tissue behavior, which is where the greatest portion of energy storage is taking place. And this is through the phase where we're actually pushing more straight down into the ground. And so this is through this middle phase of propulsion, very internally rotated dominant in this circumstance. So there's a lot of force that's going straight down into the ground in this circumstance. When the energy that's stored is released initially, this is what I would refer to as a max propulsion. And the reason being is it is this first initial release of energy. It's very big, but it's also very slow because we just came from an internally rotated state. Internal rotation is very slow. just for the record, external rotation tends to be very, very fast. So we see velocity in externally rotated positions. We see force production in internally rotated positions. And so when we're pushing straight down to the ground, obviously these are higher force conditions. We need a lot of internal rotation. After max P, we're in late propulsion. This is the reemergence of external rotation. Again, so this is where we pick up velocity in most circumstances. And so, we're going to eventually talk about into and out of the cut. And you think about like, so, well, as I come out of the cut, I'm initially doing so slowly. It's like you're pushing into the ground. You're trying to actually change direction. And then as you leave that cut, the velocity will increase. And so basically we're going forward slowly. We're absorbing energy. We're releasing that energy, and then we're going forward quickly. And that's basically the phases of propulsion. And it doesn't matter what we're talking about. We could talk about rolling across the ground. We could talk about swimming. We could talk about, like, my dog has to follow the same rules that I have to, because we move through space using the same rules. So there you go.
Okay. I think that was useful. So that was like separating, because gait sort of lives on its own little island. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can try to compare it to other things, but seeing it from more of like a propulsion perspective, that applies coherently to everything else, I think.
Reason being is because we're trying to solve problems here.
Yeah.
And we have to stop making things special that aren't special. And so if we're talking about running, we have to follow the same rules. We're moving forward through space in contact with the medium. And that means that while it might look a little bit different, and there's certain elements that might occur more quickly or over a shorter period of time, it doesn't matter. The same rules are going to apply.
Right. And then the full application of that to cutting would be, I'll try to simplify it as best I can here. Early into the cut, absorption. Middle, so transition from into to out of the cut, some max force IR moment, biggest propulsive max propulsion
energy
moment
story.
into the ground, energy, mm-hmm. And then it is releasing out of the cut, another ER display of velocity, mm-hmm. And that's your late propulsion. Right. So you have the three phases. And then that fourth thing that's not really a phase of the max propulsion is happening right at the end of middle, the instant that the heel breaks from the ground.
Right. You have an accumulation of energy. So this occurs in almost every type of situation where energy is stored. There is a point where there is a maximum amount of energy stored, and then there's the initial moment of release. If we could talk about ATP at the cellular level, as far as the charge gradient that's created by ATP. The same thing happens. There's charge that accumulates, and then there's a release of energy that would occur. So literally, we have the same type of a representation in almost every situation where we have a storage, because there's only so much energy that could be stored before there would be a release. And so propulsion is no different, follows the same rules as everything else in the universe.
Yeah. So in terms of how this relates to like cutting and change of direction, I think one of the things that it was an article you wrote, Bill, so you had this visual laid out that I found really interesting, is we look at running or straight line running or straight line sprinting, and we think, well, because the net is a straight line, we think, well, everything's in a straight line or linear, or, I think sagittal plane is like on your list of dirty words, but it's straight. Yeah. But in your article you have, well, it's actually a series of tight turns that net you forward. So, and
you're talking like a curved run?
Yeah, or even like a straight run. Even if you're just running straight, it's almost, there's like a turn from one side to the other. That's the net goes forward, but ultimately the body still has to be adding up these little subtle arcs within it. There's no video here, but I'm like arcing my hands like forward. But but then you have a lateral cut. It's just, would that just be then? It's the same thing. It's just those curves are much more drawn out. They're much bigger. Or what changes when you go from straight ahead running to these lateral runs from from a basic perspective?
It essentially has to do with the magnitude of the external rotation that would be added into the system. So think about, for you to move what you perceive to be straight sideways. Okay. That is actually a turn away from the ground contact. much greater turn than if you were going to your perceived forward straight ahead. So again, the degree of internal versus external rotation, we can sort of like ingredients in the recipe. It's like how much of each one do we need and at what point in time. And so if we had a predominantly IR representation, so just think about like again straight ahead sprinting, very IR ground contact, not a lot of ER represented. We would, if we were to look at this sequentially, if you're going to have to change direction, and if you took a snapshot of somebody that was at the point where they're still in ground contact, but as far away from that ground contact as possible, you would see a tremendous amount of external rotation that would be represented. That's why everything is a turn, and that's why the dirt, like one of the dirty words would be a sagittal plane, because when we're talking about dynamic movement, we're moving on helices, and so if we're moving on helices, then there are no orthogonal planes. We can turn, but we can't move in these straight lines in reality. We perceive straight lines because we have cancellations of turns that allow us to go in a specific direction, but everything is turns.
Yeah, the thing that interests me, I guess, first, like before getting into details, because I also think too, it's interesting to think about, okay, well, what are we doing in the weight room? We're doing a straight line lunge, a lateral lunge, a 45-degree lunge, like what? And usually that's only under the context of, okay, we're doing lateral lunges to train our adductors, which certainly they do lengthen the adductors. Absolutely. There's that there. But I also think about, well, what other things are happening? And my frame of reference is, and I've seen this, if you just go play sports, like I'll have athletes warm up with soccer and then they go run the 20 and they run way faster. Of course, there's a lot of stuff. It's a game, it's competitive. But I'd heard that even in the NFL Combine, athletes, when they ran the pro agility first, or it was some combine that happened, it was found when the pro agility was run first that actually improved or helped the time in the 40. And yeah, it's a warm up or whatever, but I can't help but think, because I've had similar experiences in doing like change of direction work and then seeing afterwards things that are more straight line in nature tend to be, there's an enhancing effect. And I'm sure that, if you're running like the 200 and it's super linear and drawn out, maybe it's a little bit different story, but just, I think that there's a lot there. And I think about, you mentioned like the external rotation piece, and I think about velocity. So I'm just curious what's happening from like a bigger external rotation, I guess an on-ramp, you could say, that the body could use if I can use this if I'm now going to be going linear afterwards.
I would lean in the direction that it would be it wouldn't be the ER that would be the primer, if you would, for the nervous system. I would think it'd be the IR element of it, right? So having access to internal rotation. So again, we think about high force. So if you think about sprinting in the perceived straight line, your velocity is going to be associated with your ability to apply force directly into the ground. So I would think that there would be a priming effect that would be associated with the changes of direction because of the amount of force that would be applied into the ground, the amount of internal rotation that is associated with the point where you are actually maximizing connective tissue behavior, energy storage, and then the change of direction. There's a tremendous amount of internal rotation that's represented there. I would think that would be the priming, if you will, to the number one, the shape change that has to take place. So again, for internal and external rotation require different representations of skeletal shape. So I would lean towards the fact that you probably primed the force production through IR.
Yeah, so I think it's knowing that IR, max IR, and middle propulsion is going to be the biggest resistance to forward motion, which when you think about change of direction is that, like, and there's lots of repetitions of that. There's lots of time accumulated with these IR demands with like a 5-10-5 pro agility, whatever. So that's going to prime you. I would say my assumption would be I would see better starts and accelerations, and I would see better shorter sprint performance. But if I was going to, like you had even mentioned intuitively, like 200 maybe wouldn't be as good, 400. Anything that's show is I need to display ER, I need to be off the ground. That lives in the opposite place from like an agility drill, because agility is a lot of time on the ground, a lot of IR, a lot of force down into the ground. It's pretty slow, long ground contacts. that's going to get you better acceleration. That's going to get you better short sprint performance, but probably not the longer velocity based off the ground stuff. It would be my assumption.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like you said, if we were to stretch this thing out to 200 meters, we would probably see a different type of effect.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not, because that's the thing that actually threw me, it's more ER, the change of direction, but it's more, but if you look at where the actual point of maximal downforce is, like that max P, and it's often also with the lower center of gravity that you're changing direction. That's the thing. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. So hang on. Yeah. So we also have to think about the degree of relative movement that would be available and necessary. So when we talk about a change of direction, so you mentioned it's like you have to lower your center of gravity. So we have more joint motion that is required because we have to dampen a great deal of the energy. So if we're going into a cut, think about this: the sharper the cut, the greater your capacity to have to slow down, so you can actually change directions. And so this is an acquisition of relative motion in internal rotation, which could have a beneficial effect. Again, when you think about the starting positions that you might be using, like if you were to run a 40 and you're coming out of a stance, there could be an advantage there just from the initial get-go. If you were to not have to access the relative motion, then maybe if there was no acceleration, if we were just doing, say, a flying 20, that's a whole different story, because the amount of relative movement that would be required in that circumstance is actually less. So again, it's like we have to look at a couple of effects that would be, and as I mentioned before, sort of like a primer to the system. It's like what do we need in certain circumstances? Do we need more relative motion? Do we need longer ground contact times for force production, or do we need the higher velocity component? And if we're looking at, again, the short sprints, we really don't. In a lot of cases, these guys don't necessarily reach their peak velocity at that point. They're still accelerating.
Today's podcast is sponsored by Gym Studio. Gym Studio is a frictionless gym and studio management software. It can effortlessly manage memberships, schedule classes, track attendance, and even automate billing. To check out what Gym Studio can do for you, head to gymstudio.com and set up your free 14-day trial in less than 5 minutes. Yeah, it reminds me of, and this might be a good exploration of this concept, is in one of your articles you had written on UHP, Bill, you talked about moving slow, moving fast, and then the relative, and then the orienting, which I think is so fascinating, because I think little is thought. Usually it's like, oh, you're moving slow. Well, I don't know, using slow twitch muscle, or it's more motor control. It's like those kind of ideas are usually the first things that go in people's heads, but versus the idea of that fostering more of a relative motion versus when you go fast, you orient. And I think just the orienting and relative motion is, I don't know if we talked about that much in the last podcast, but maybe just to get into that a little bit, because I think there's so much really good stuff there that we can also talk about.
Okay. So I have a really weird example. Okay. So relative motion tends to be a slowing down, and it tends to dampen or dissipate energy. So this is going forward slowly. My weird example, I live in Indianapolis. It's unavoidable that at some point in time, somebody's going to talk about race cars. Okay. Race cars used to be made out of metal, and when they crash, they would stay in one piece, and then the driver would have to absorb all of the energy. So there's a lot of death and then a lot of serious injuries associated with race car crashes. Now the cars actually explode into 1 billion pieces. The more pieces that you have that are moving, the greater the energy is dissipated into all of those pieces. So when we talk about relative motion, we're actually trying to get as many of our pieces to move separately as possible as dampeners to the energy that we have to be able to absorb or dampen. So again, if we're going into a cut at full speed, we have to be able to slow down, come to a stop, and then actually go in a different direction. So we have to be able to separate our body into as many segments as possible. We have predetermined segments. We call them joints, right? So we use that. So we use the relative motion at those joints to allow these things to occur. So we're dampening some of the energy. We're absorbing a lot of energy into the connective tissues that actually secure the joints. So that's great because we can actually take that energy and redirect it as we come out of the cut. But when we need a higher force application, the relative motion is a dampener. So it actually takes away our ability to produce force. So what we want to do under those circumstances is we want to take all of those segments that we had that were moving separately as dampeners or energy absorbers, and then we want to hook them back together. And so this is what we would call orientation. So an orientation is taking multiple segments and moving them together as one. And so if we were to look at the differential between going into a cut and out of the cut, we have more relative motion going into the cut for the reasons that we've already expressed. We have less relative motion coming out of the cut because we are applying a much higher force on the back end of this change of direction, and we want to be able to produce the greatest velocity that would be associated after that force application, right? So we have to tie things back together. So let's use another example. If I was doing a max effort back squat, very little relative motion associated with that activity, just enough for me to move through whatever the excursion of that movement would be. Because again, if I have more relative motion that would be available to me, number one, I would have a reduction in motor output to the musculature. So I don't want to turn my max effort squat into an explosive eccentric and then become a wet spot on the floor. I want to be able to turn this thing around, right? So I have to restrict the relative motions in a maximum effort. When we're on the back end of this change of direction, where we have this high force application back into the ground, I have to be able to reduce the relative motions. Otherwise, I can come to a stop in that circumstance. So that is somebody that is using relative motion into a cut, and then allowing that energy to dissipate into the ether, as it were, and never actually moving into an orientation in most circumstances.
Yeah, that I love that answer because it makes me think too about, well, one, like if we go back to track and like, all right, you're in the 200 or the 400 and it's all straight line, there's more relative orientations happening to get you, you're just going in one direction. But if you're changing direction, or even starting or doing anything I was even thinking about a single leg jump or a jump, because there's a jump is still powerful, but there is more of a braking phase. And one of the most clear as a bell, I always think about this because the highest I ever jumped in high school was my coach. I've told this story. Sorry for everyone who's heard this story like way too many times. My coach just blasted us with change of directions and suicide sprints at the end of practice, and I found the highest I could ever jump off one leg. I got like 2-3 inches above the top of the square, so touching 11.7, and I'm 6'1", was after all those sprints. And we had been obviously doing it. It wasn't the first time. We'd been doing it for a long time. But there was something about that stimulus, and obviously very a lot of racing and a lot of that stuff. But there was something about that. And I think about, okay, in a jump, I've heard this talked about like a high jump by Darian Bars talked about managing collisions. And when you plant a high jump, you don't want an iron rod. You have to have some level of relative motion to manage that initial ka-chunk, or otherwise your leg would snap. Something's got to give. I just think, and you said it, Bill, it's not just doing like a lateral lunge. And I know there's this too, but it's there's this dynamic connective tissue, just quick. There's also this quick storage and release of connective tissues that makes that more dynamic. So it's just cool to think about that, like how this is different than straight line sprinting, but it also fits within propulsion. It's just, it's like a cousin. It's or a relative. It's they're both needed,
Yeah, same rules. I mean, the same rules apply. You're always going to be storing and releasing the energy in the connective tissues. It's just in what circumstance. We have to understand the conditions and then how much relative motion would be expressed. There would always be relative motion expressed, just to different degrees. Like kind of like your comparison to the high jump versus a cut. I got news for you. You're changing direction when you're doing a high jump, whether you like it or not. It's that's the reality. Okay, but do I want to dampen as much of the energy in a high jump as the change of direction? Absolutely not. Because if I dampen to the same degree, I got news for you. You might be able to clear the pit, but you're not going to clear the bar, right?
Yeah, it's just the nature of that impulse is certainly a little bit different for sure.
Yeah, and it also will require, when we're talking about the phases of propulsion, you're not going to have as much of a early representation in the final steps of like a high jump, for instance. You're going to want to be pushed farther towards late so that you can get that sort of explosion release of energy. That's the priority. And then you'll also see, that's when you see like the different adaptations of sprinters, like a big anterior orientation, a flatter foot that's going to push them farther forward into that late propulsive representation. That's an adaptation that's going to be advantageous for them because it puts them closer to that energy release phase, and it allows them to stay off the ground for more time. Bolt's, how many steps did Usain Bolt have in the 100 versus everybody else? Like 3 less or something like that.
Yeah.
So he was clearly off the ground longer. He's clearly displaying velocity in over a longer period of time than everyone else. And that allows him to be faster towards the end of the race, because that's when the ER component and the velocity component really comes into play.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about, like the early and late stance and those pieces. And that's where I think it can, unless we have like a visual and we could say, okay, here's this person and here's this, it can get, I think just audio only, it can get a little confusing.
Well, yeah, early is your like heel. It's going to be, if you think about the rocker phases of gait models that are introduced, it's like the heel rocker is your early phase. Your ankle rocker through the middle is your middle phase, and then your toe rocker off of that, the first metatarsal head and the big toe that's late. So that's where you think about that in terms of where the center of gravity is represented in your foot, and that will let you know what we're talking about when we say like a late representation would be farther forward, more towards that toe rocker position. Heel is off the ground. I think that might help.
Yeah.
It's just representative of the shape changes that need to occur during each phase of propulsion.
Right.
Yeah. And I hesitate, and so there'll be those that go, well, what if we're talking about walking? Why don't you call it like stance? Because you're not standing; you're actually moving forward through space. So again, that's why. Again, you're moving forward slowly in the early phase. You're still going forward. We're not standing. If we're standing, we're actually standing in dead center middle IR. That's where we would do that, and there would be no forward movement. It would be a stop, and that would be the difference between propelling versus just standing. So we don't use stance. It's incoherent with the explanation.
Yeah. So
this is why I have the list of dirty words.
Yeah.
Right. We want to be but we want to be coherent, right? Because it creates confusion otherwise.
Yeah. I think it is interesting in the sense of, in training, physical preparation, speed, linear speed is such a huge, piece of it. It's always trying to improve. We're always trying to improve 40-yard dashes and these things, but it's interesting to think about, and deceleration, obviously a big thing too, and change of direction, and a common, piece as well. Is change of direction representative to what's happening on the field? Based off what you're saying though, it seems like, if you look at it just generally, general physical competencies, and we aren't talking about, what you're perceiving, but just your general ability to get into and out of a cut, it does seem like just that quality from an injury prevention standpoint, and to be able to create relative motions is extremely valuable, because you could be very fast in a straight line, and I'm fast, but can you create relative motions? And so I wanted to ask you as well, okay, I think the weight room where things are happening at a slower pace may also be a good place to look at, well, how is this happening? And I think you mentioned like something like a goblet squat, or a slow squat you're breathing through. Or could you talk about things that are really drawing out relative motion, relevant to like what's happening in like a longer change of direction? How might we see that in the weight room, in a weight room gym type setting?
Well, we need to rule out the things that are going to limit relative motions first and foremost. Okay, high force, high velocity. Okay, so those are the two extremes, and these will be at the ends of it. The ends of propulsion are going to be more externally rotated represented versus IR, and then the dead center middle is going to be more IR represented at the extremes of propulsion. So the extreme of early, the extreme of middle, the extreme of late is where the least amount of relative motion is going to be demonstrated. So the higher the force application, the higher the velocity demonstrated, the least amount of relative motion is going to be represented. Okay. If we were to compare the transition from middle to late or early to middle propulsion, early to middle will have the greatest representation of relative motion available to you. Okay. Motor output is lower. So these are not your maximum effort exercises. These would not be the activities that you would be training to failure. We would use resistances, but we use resistance to lead the movement to acquire relative motions, not to negate the relative motion. Where, again, in most circumstances, when people talk about the weight room, they're talking about high velocity or high force. Okay. If we give up the capacity, if we train the capacity to acquire relative motion away, now we might be compromising somebody's capacity to decelerate, as you mentioned before. And if that is an element of their performance, now we've actually set them up for a potential. I hesitate to make it predictive, but this is where we use the wrong strategy at the wrong time. If I use a late propulsive strategy and an early propulsive representation, the energy is actually being transferred in the wrong direction. This is usually where all of your great injuries occur. So for instance, if I put too much ER through an ankle and I apply force into the ground, that's a lateral ankle sprain. If I apply too much ER through the hip and I'm at top speed sprinting, that's a hamstring strain. So like I said, all of our favorite injuries tend to be situations where we're trying to apply high force in a high velocity situation with less relative motion. If we can reacquire relative motions, number one, in a rehab setting, that's usually our step one, is to try to reacquire as much relative motion as possible, because now we have an athlete that can actually perform the activities that will protect them and allow them to dampen the energies away from the areas where you would typically be absorbing energy that produces the injury.
Yeah, I think an example that will really resonate with a lot of people because of its current popularity in training is like lunges or squats with your heels off the ground, as this, like, people think it's this injury prevention thing for a knee. What's actually quite the opposite, just based on what Bill just said. Like, you're trying to represent something that is, if we're doing a goblet squat, for instance, and you're taking the heels off the ground, you've actually lessened the ability to capture relative motion in that position. And if you're saying, oh, well, if I bring my heels up, it puts me on my toe, and that's where we play sports, and all these different arguments that I've heard about why it's good, and I can stay more upright, or I can get deeper into the squat. You're not actually acquiring the relative motions without that heel contact, and with that toe extension, the heel off the ground. So that is actually working in the opposite way of what you might be trying to use it for.
Yeah, I think having that purpose is important. And I think about, a good example for that one. Well, something before I mentioned something, Eric Huddleston had brought up this order of weekly training from a perspective of it was like if you play a game on Saturday or the weekend, you come back, and the first weight room session on Monday would be, and it was like what you were saying, it's Bill, it's early to middle, like more things that push you back in space that can help. Like a heels elevated goblet squat, full range, that kind of thing that can help recapture those motions. And then the second session in the week, going closer to playing again, would be more like explosive, faster, heavier type work that I'm assuming that carries more of an orientation type value to it. And I was also going to ask you, Bill, you said like every time you go to failure, I think like anytime you would take a set to failure, even if it's, I guess, lighter, there's probably gonna be more orientation happening, or more things that have to move together at the end to hold that together, to hold that set together, just to make it
there's
work.
actually research. There's actually research on this. When you look at the motor behavior that's associated with like a 1 rep max, or you take a 10 RM weight to 10 reps, the motor behavior actually is very similar. So you're actually reducing relative motion as you progress through the set, because you think about it, it's like, so based on motor units that are dropping out, if I try to continue through a set, I have to continue to try to recruit motor units to continue that set, right? And so again, even though you're experiencing fatigue, you're still recruiting at that point. And so if I do increase the motor output under that circumstance, I'm actually reducing the amount of relative motion that I have, which means that you're potentially bending joints against the natural relative motion mechanics. So can you bend a knee that's in a late propulsive position? Absolutely, you can. However, the strategy that you would have to use would be to alter coordination for force production through middle propulsion. You actually have to change the muscle position to allow that joint to bend. That's not really an element of movement that we want to teach. We want people to understand how to decelerate, how to produce force into the ground, and then how to recapture the velocity. If I'm using a high velocity position of the knee and I'm bending it against the mechanics, once again, we have a great situation of this is where you would sprain an MCL. This is where the joint mechanics exist for a medial meniscus tear. It's like, this is not things that we want to teach people to produce in the weight room.
Yeah. I think a lot of times we're in a hurry to find all the highest force things we can possibly do. And it makes sense from an order of operations to, okay, on one side, we have all the things that can give you relative motion and give you pain-free ranges and things. On the other side, you have really fast sprints and explosive throws and everything you would do in the field. And I think that's where it does get muddy in performance is the middle. Okay, here's some explosive stuff in the middle. And I think that is where also understanding more of these mechanics and the propulsion, the phases of propulsion, I think can provide a window. Well, how do we best use those pieces in the middle? Just because, it could be something that gives you too much of one thing. Or
I think in terms of like context of training, if we want to do this sort of coherent zoom in, zoom out, we could take it from the perspective of like a training session or like a macro cycle. So for instance, if I'm bringing someone into a session, we're warming up, we're foam rolling, we're doing movement preparation stuff. I'm trying to acquire a range of motion. I'm using easier techniques to try to get through this earlier phase and absorption. And then I ramp things up through the middle of the workout. So I have higher rate of force development. I have higher forces being put into the ground, more IR representation. And then if I'm going to go back to like a cool down, then I'm trying to reacquire that range of motion again, put them back out into the world, having these ranges of motion to allow them to recover between sessions. That's just the whole into the cut, out of the cut representation in one training session. Or as like Eric's example that you had said, over the course of a week, I can take someone who has like their athletic performance on the weekend, immediately after that, try to reacquire the ranges of motion and the relative motions I may have lost through the sport early on in the week. And then through the middle of the week, where I have the longest period between playing, I can try to bring the force production, most IR, high connective tissue behavior. And then maybe towards the end of the week, towards my athletic endeavor or my game, I can use a more later out of the cut representation to prep for that game. And then there's like a week example. Mm-hmm. And then you could even make it all go into several months of training where you have like an earlier into the cut phase of 4 to 6 weeks. You could have a maximum IR bilateral lifting, stopping forward motion phase that might be like very heavy into bilateral lifts and presses and stuff like that. And then you could have a later post or pre-season phase that's late out of the cut, more sports specific, more field work, more late representations like we were talking about. And that could be a 12-week progression right there with the same coherent into the cut, out of the cut, early, middle, late P that we've talked about throughout this conversation.
Yeah, you'll see it represented if you were to look at, again, so when you have a predictive performance cycle, then you can pre-calculate what element of propulsion that you're going to emphasize, what would be ideal. Like, again, so from a recovery standpoint, that's relative motion. That's where blood flow exists. So think about this. It's like the more muscle activity you have, the greater the reduction of blood flow. So again, so recapturing, recovering. So, if we're talking about an NFL player, we know what day of the week they're going to be playing. If we have a professional soccer player, we know what day of the week they're going to be playing. If we understand the performance cycle, then again we can structure this. What Chris was just talking about looks more like an off season to preseason type of a structured program, where that early phase in the off season is okay. We need to recover. Maybe we've got some boo-boos that we've got to resolve, right? So we're going to spend a lot more time working on the relative motion side of propulsion, not so much the high force conditions or high velocity conditions, but as we get closer and closer to the season, then we're going to see that transition into high force, high velocity again. Yeah. So it's like everything says that. Well, that's what we've always done. That is true. That would be ideal. But now we're using a coherent representation. So again, we're eliminating interference to reasoning is what we're trying to do.
Yeah, we're not reinventing the wheel. A lot of people have been doing this stuff for years and it worked, but we're giving everyone more of a coherent representation of why it has worked.
Yeah.
Instead of just being like, this is the only way to train. It's like all of these people are training in this way and have been for so many years. It's just we're offering a coherent reason for why.
Yeah. I think having that central principle of just relative motion, because there's different ways to get that, but even little nuances like, Bill, you mentioned, like if you go to failure, because a lot of times in a prep phase, you might have a hypertrophy phase if people still do that. And there could be some failure associated with that, but it's like, well, what repercussion from opening up space might that have if I'm going to then follow it up with force production or those types of concepts?
Well, we see the unfortunate circumstance where, we'll be working with an athlete and then we have to send them away to wherever they may go to school or with an organization that they work with. And they wouldn't necessarily follow these same principles because, their primary concern would be, again, from a force producing standpoint. Take a collegiate pitcher who's, you put 200 pounds on his trap bar deadlift, but to do that, you just sacrificed 4 miles per hour on his top end throwing velocity, or you reduced his ability to capture relative motion, and now he's got an elbow problem. It's like these are the concerns that we have when we don't account for these different representations in propulsion, because we can actually identify like who needs what and at what time. And if we ignore that and we just concern ourselves with, again, the traditional view of, we need just increased force without concern over the negative secondary consequences, that creates problems.
Yeah, I do think it changes as well the way that it's like, okay, yes, we've been doing this for a long time, but it also allows you to think about, like, example, exercise in a warm-up. Like Chris, you mentioned, you could work through a phase or a week from relative motions into more explosive, more orienting type things. You could work in a day, but if you're doing it in a day, you could start with a lot of things that are more relative into your high force. But I even think about, well, what's sometimes, we can get very complex with movement prep. All right, here's our 8 movement prep exercises. But sometimes I think about, well, what if you just used a sled drag or a loaded carry, like I like the idea of like a sandbag carry. And I was thinking about, Bill, what you said, things that are slow are more relative. So being able to warm up with really simple, slower things like a loading carry or a walk or something, it gives you a different thought on the rules by which you can then ramp up. Or I've heard you mention, Bill, I've thought about this ever since I heard you say it, is if you exhale through the reversal in a squat, that's more of a relative motion conducive thing than that, like where you're exhaling into a closed glottis, or things like even the way we choose to breathe through things and use our breath in warm-ups. I'd be curious for you to expand or anything you might have on that topic.
The greatest degree of relative motion exists during tidal breathing, to give you an idea. So it's like the breathing that you would use at rest would have the least amount of effort that would be associated with this, right? So our ability to breathe through an activity. So it's not just the fact that you could take air in and let air out, because we actually have forced inhalations and forced exhalations that are associated with greatest effort. So as we move closer and closer to tidal breathing, that's why we can't use these really high effort activities to reacquire relative motions, because that the forced breathing strategies are interference, because it is representative of, again, a higher force strategy. So one of the things that you can use as your guide is, can you breathe through an activity efficiently? So for instance, let's take 200 kilograms, we'll put it on a barbell, and I'm going to say, try to squat that and try to breathe through it with a relaxed type of effort breathing. Good luck with that. Not going to happen, because again, they don't work together that way. If you were to try to use the relaxed tidal breathing for a max effort lift, once again, you're doing an explosive eccentric and you're sitting on the floor, because you did access relative motion and then you were accelerated to the ground by the external load. So again, you can associate your ability to move air, how well you do it, and the type of effort that is required to do it will help guide you in your process as to whether you're accessing relative motions or producing higher forces.
Yeah, just about the best I felt. Oh, sorry. I'll just say this real quick, Chris. Is just about the best I felt after a workout was one day. It was doing this podcast. I was on location. I went to the guy Mike Salemi's house. It was in the Bay Area when I lived there, and he ran me through it was just a shorter workout, but it was basically like a very tough warm up, but it was all based on cable exercises and breathing. We breathed through everything. Every single thing we did, we had a specific inhale and exhale with a phase of motion. And I honestly don't think I'd ever felt better like the next day after that. I just felt really good. Like everything was moving really well. It felt kind of bouncy and springy. And I've heard other people say the same thing, like when they're breathing through every activity. And of course, there is that time to be forceful at high force, heavy weights. If I'm accelerating and I have to have a higher pressure, we certainly need to have those things. But just from like a recovery and feeling good standpoint, that's something I've been more and more aware of as I've gone further along in my journey.
Yeah, I mean, the whole exhale inhale thing is coherent with everything else that we're talking about. So the inhale ER, exhale IR, you can bias it and play with it however you want. If you want to try to get more of if you're trying to acquire more interrotation in a certain position, you can exhale. If you're trying to open up more relative motion in space, you can inhale. And that's typically how we see these things paired. When you have someone who's like a squeezer and you're dealing with some type of issue, they're probably holding their breath when they're doing stuff. And that's a big tell as a coach for when you need to address the breathing with an activity, is if they're grunting a lot to do things, if they're always sort of holding their breath and you hear this sort of like gasping kind of like type of sound as they're moving, that's all indicative of what, depending on what you're looking for, obviously. But yeah, it's coherent with everything else we've talked about so far.
Yeah. And that certainly can get the weight lifted. You can make you the weight room all-star. And, maybe that makes, the coach happy that you did it. But it is interesting to think about, or even like going to failure, like there comes that point where the muscle alone and basic good motions can't do it. So the body has to start compressing more things together to get the lift done.
How often are you breathing easily when you're at the final parts of the failure exercise? If you're going for a set of 8 to 10 and you're on like 8, 9, 10, you're probably not breathing anymore at that point. You're holding your breath. You're trying to grind it out. You've lost all relative motion from fatigue and just orienting to push the weight up to finish.
Yeah. It's interesting to think too, like even, you don't want to demonize anything. I think going to failure, especially like just doing like arms, like bro stuff, I find it interesting. Like when I was, this was like a month or two before my wedding. I remember it well. I was doing a lot of like arm training in my program. This was 11 years ago now. And it was funny because at the tail end of that, I wasn't doing any shoulder or neck work at all. But when I got to my wedding day or the day before, I put on this, like the shirt, like the nice shirt I had under my suit, and the neck wouldn't fit anymore. And I hadn't been doing any like neck stuff, but I think my body
you were actually.
Yeah, I was doing so much. Yeah, I was, but I'm so much more aware of that now, because I guarantee if you go back in time and I like watch myself from the inside out doing that. There was a lot of breath holding. It was a lot of drop sets. So starting with the 50s, doing like 3 reps of the 50s and then going all the way down to the 10s, and how much like breath holding and how much orientation of everything firing together. And it kind of makes me think about, like Pavel Tsatsouline, the part of the people that talks about irradiation, like everything working together to make you strong. It seems like that would be synonymous, right, with orientation, I would imagine. Like if more muscle groups are working together.
Just gripping as hard as you can, biting down as hard as you can, holding your breath against pressure. Like, that is everything. That is an orientation strategy, big time.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I know when I do like arm curls now, a lot of times like this is like the winter, so it's like my rock climbing season. And so I always do try to do a lot of good arm work because my elbows actually can get kind of torched up if I just am doing all this pulling. Maybe there's something there too. But I find if I do curl work, it has to be like I have to be supinating on the way up, like kind of Zotman curls, where you're doing this, but I also have to like breathe and relax. And it's just I still get the pump and it's great, but it's a different mentality than what I would have had 12 years ago. And my elbows feel better.
That's propulsion as well, like early, middle.
Use Zotman curl all the time because when we talk about relative motion at the elbow, it's like
maybe Bill talk.
Tell about the Zotman. Explain the Zotman too.
Early, middle, late Zotman curl stuff.
Yeah. So ER and IR are always superimposed. It's just a matter of recognition of degree, right? So there'll be more ER. So if you were to bend your elbow with the forearm in traditional supination, that's actually an external rotation. That's an early propulsion, external rotation represented. If I do that in the IR position or pronated position, that is actually, and bending the elbow, that is actually the early IR that would be more represented under those circumstances. The nice thing about the Zotman curl is that we get the early ER representation, the early IR representation, and therefore we retain a greater degree of relative movement at the elbow. So we use these all the time because think about the baseball pitchers that come in and they're lacking internal rotation at the elbow, which is underappreciated. Most people are just bending the elbow under any circumstance, and they say, well, the elbow bends. And I would argue that you have to have the appropriate mechanics to bend the elbow effectively with relative motion. Otherwise, kind of like we were just talking about the knees earlier, it's like we have an elbow that's bending against the mechanics, and then you wonder why we're seeing, a thrower with medial elbow pain. You're a spear chucker, right?
Yeah, I threw. Yeah, still do. Yeah, still get out there and throw.
Like how many? Okay, it was like a rite of passage as a javelin thrower to walk around with an ice cup on your medial elbow after a throwing session because of the amount of ER that you're spending all this time in. And it's like, and then if you superimpose a weight room strategy that is going to compress you A to P, you will have lost a massive amount of internal rotation at the elbow, which is why you end up with all of this medial elbow stuff, whether it be a flexor tendinopathy, whether it be a bone chip, whether it be ulnar nerve hypermobility, that they might call it, or even like a sprain, medial elbow sprain. It's like all of those things are associated with the loss of internal rotation at the elbow. And if we could do something that's fun for most people, who doesn't want to do arm work at the end of their workouts, right? And we can actually use that to our advantage. Like I said, the Zotman curl checks a lot of boxes. It's not the only thing that we would do. And again, we have very specific things that we would do depending on needs, but it is one of those things that represents the greatest. It's a terrific exercise that's easy to use, doesn't have a strong learning curve. But the one thing that I would argue is that if you were to compare sort of like your max effort dumbbell curl, you would never be able to use your maximum load in a Zotman curl. Yeah. For the very reason is that we are retaining some measure of relative motion. Yeah. Still hard, still fun, but terribly useful.
Oh, yeah. It's good to know I was on the right track with that. All I know is it feels good.
Well, yeah.
my elbow.
It
makes my elbow feel
intuitive though.
It's
like very.
Yeah. So we were talking about earlier. It's like people gravitating towards things that feel good or things that have always worked. There can be a reason why, and that's kind of what we're trying to offer here with this early, middle, late propulsion. why does that feel good? We just have a way, we have a way to explain it. It's like, why do these ways that people program for exercise for their athletes, why do these ways work? Like, we have a way to explain it with this model. That's kind of what we're attempting to do.
It just magnifies your success with reasoning through problems.
Right. Coherence. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. It kind of,
there are, if anyone else is interested in that, like Bill has, there are on YouTube, there are a bunch of simple solution videos that Bill did years ago that are just basically just like arm training, but with specific reasons for like recapturing certain ranges of motion or relative motions.
yeah, when I do it now, it is funny. I think about it differently now. If you would have asked me Zottman curl when I was in grad school for applied sports science was my degree, you know, I saw in the programming, like the programs the GAs were doing, there was a lot of Zottman curls in there. And my understanding at the time was, it gets your forearms better, which, I mean, in a sense, yes, there are muscles in your forearms. It definitely will work more. But now when I do it, it's more like how much like kind of spiraling or helixing can I get in a way that feels really good? Like even at the top, getting my pinkies up more, like really maxing out that external rotation, and then just feeling the control on the way down just feels good. So I'm like, this is why I'm sure it does get my forearms in a unique way, but it definitely feels good. I'm curious actually, is there a similar principle, like the same way that Zottman curl works from that spiraling effect upper body? Is there a lower body movement that could parallel that or be an example that could parallel that? I know you don't have the freewheeling foot, I guess, so maybe it's not really possible, but it'd be interesting to look at that too.
Well, okay. So when you're fixing the foot to the ground, okay, we're going to have a representation of internal rotation. What we're trying to do, like let's compare elbows to knees. What we're trying to do at the knee is to assure that we have the acquisition of the early IR, just like we would. So the Zottman curl would be, again, representative of early ER, early IR. The descent of the lead leg in the split squat is very much in the same representation. So as long as we have control of the tibia, as long as we have control of the femur, we can actually use a split squat in the same way that we would the Zottman curl, because there's an acquisition of early IR, and then the representation of early ER at the beginning of the split squat. It actually flip-flops. It actually becomes a late representation on the way back up. But that's why we use those activities.
Yeah.
That's why we have always used those activities, right? It's also one of the reasons why and granted, there's people that can lift very, very heavy loads in a split squat. I totally get that. But if we were to compare your max effort split squat to your max effort squat, I would hazard to guess your max effort squat's going to win every day of the week, right? So it's a reduced load. We're actually going to be accessing more relative motion in the lower extremity joints in that circumstance compared to a max effort squat. So again, that's why we use these split stance activities. That's why we use single leg activities, because it allows us to access the relative motions that are protective in our ability to slow down.
Yeah, that fits with something that well before I was aware of your work, Bill. It was myself, Cal Dietz. Cameron Joss was actually one who I think had mentioned or pitched this idea to me. And it was on the idea of working from basically single leg to double leg over the year. Like, okay, we're going to start with more single leg activities and then we'll work into our double leg. I think it's very similar to what we talked about, like going from more things that naturally are more relative in nature to things that naturally give you a chance to be a little bit more orienting or force producing as you go along. I guess it's almost like the simplest way you can think about it in some ways, if you just throw everything else off the table. But it's good to think about, like, to me, the breathing thing, it's like you have to think about that. So crucial and fundamental.
Yeah.
So just a few more things here, just to kind of I did want to come back to a few things, but I did want to talk about orienting a little bit, just because, we've talked a lot about relative, restoring motions, the ability to do movements in a healthy manner, but there's also is that force end of the equation, and things like, I'd be curious, like talking about things like, okay, like things that are in the middle. All right. So we have all in one end, we have relative things in one end, we have high speed, sprinting and plyos and throws. Think like a box squat, for example, or something. And I know there's different yielding, right? But like maybe just talk about something in the middle that we can talk about, like, okay, how is this orienting? How can we steer this? So maybe things like a squat or a box squat. How might we go into that looking at okay, we're going to get more orienting and more force producing, and what are some grounds to start looking at that? Putting that in the program.
On the front and the back end, we've got early and late propulsion, which is our greater representation of turns, because we have the superimposed ERs and IRs, and then we can identify both. So this is where most of the turning takes place. When we're talking about dead center middle, this is the least amount of turn. The predominant representation that we see in that circumstance is internal rotation. These are the higher forces. These are the cancellations of turns. This is coming to a stop, which is, again, our higher forces are always associated with the least amount of movement. Therefore, that's what they are for. So in situations where high force application is necessary, that's where you're going to use those activities. In most sporting events, there is a moment in time. There's a moment in time where high force is necessary, and that we have tremendous benefit in using these activities because the force is met. Mm-hmm. So if I have to apply a high force into the ground, I need less relative motion. That's middle P. It's also where I'm going to hold my breath. I'm going to create the highest pressures internally, and that's where I'm going to produce my high force conditions. The problem that we run into, the interference of such things, is if I train somebody to produce higher and higher forces, but I have increased the duration element of the impulse, and that is transferred into the sporting event, I just made somebody slow. That's the problem. Or because I've got relative motion on the front end of propulsion, if I expand my middle propulsive representation into the spaces where I needed the superimposition of internal and external rotation, I took away movement.
Yeah.
And now I'm going to use a compensatory strategy to try to fulfill my relative motion needs. Now we have, again, stress that we probably don't want in certain areas, which again could lead to the potential for injury.
Yeah, one of my favorite perennial, like ever since I was in college, we just talk about things that come up naturally, like the Zottman curl. Like this came up naturally, was doing, I always never felt, every time I did squats to parallel, heavy or higher reps or anything, my explosiveness was always diminished in coordination and everything for like 3 to 5 days typically. But I found that going about maybe 3 to 4 inches above parallel to a box, but not sitting on it, just touch and go, bam. That was always the best. Like I felt very explosive, and it makes sense to me that point, it's almost like whatever that point of max IR is, that 0 point, if it can just be this explosive isometric or explosive impulse that you get off of, that's almost like the most pure, in some ways, way of doing it. I suppose as a narrow myself, it has to be even faster. There might be people who could go longer or wide who needs more time, but for me, that's always been, and especially with more narrow type archetypes, jumper type people, that's always been a real great way to get that.
What you end up doing in that situation is you're just you're biasing yourself from middle propulsion to late, which again is, so think about it, in most circumstances where high velocity is represented, it is preceded by an impulse, right, of some sort. So that's going to be force times time. So in your circumstances, so you come from a track and field representation, very high forces, but in very, very small windows of time. Right. And so again, so if you're biasing yourself into the phase of propulsion where that is the greatest representation, so you're not moving into an earlier representation, so you're actually limiting the amount of relative motion that you're going to be demonstrating. You're going to be at the point where you're producing the highest amount of force and then the greatest representation of velocity afterwards. So again, it behoove you. So this is like Chris was talking about, like developing this annual plan or a morphocycle that fits within a performance realm. It's like, this is the stuff that you would use to tune your system for highest force, high velocity right before you would perform. Yeah. So it stands to reason. Again, it's like you're doing things intuitively, you're through discovery, right? But had you had the same amount of reasoning beforehand, it wouldn't have been a matter of like, oh, I just happened to do this at the right time, and then it turned out well. You actually have now reasoning applied to the programming that allow you to produce potentially a more predictive outcome.
Yeah,
probability. Let's be specific. It's very
probabilities. Yeah. So
your probabilities are in your favor.
the higher position of that squat is, we're taking this back to the propulsion conversation. That's going to be a later representation of propulsion. And structurally, it fits your structure as a narrow individual better, because the parallel position, the sticking point for a narrow is it's tough, because you cannot acquire that IR position of your pelvis and that nutated sacrum. It just won't happen. So you kind of have to you can approximate it, but for you, the most IR is probably going to be above that 90-90 position that you always feel bad about, because in order to bury yourself and hold that position, you have to compensate somehow. Because you can't, your inherent structure is not going to allow you to acquire that orthogonal position very well, or I should say authentically. So then you kind of feel the secondary consequences of that for days afterwards. While the other way is, it's still ER represented, it matches your structure. It's more on the late propulsion, producing force or producing side of things. So you feel bouncier. You feel bouncier afterwards.
Yeah.
It's coherent still.
Yeah, that's that thing. It's interesting to use I feel bouncy after doing this, and then that basically means you manage your pelvic floor IR in the window you needed to.
Huge tell. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. You see it in treatment too. Like if Bill treats somebody and they get off the table and they feel light and they feel like when they push down, stuff goes up. Like that's what you're trying to get when you have relative motion. If you feel like you're getting dragged into the floor, your feet feel really heavy, you feel like you've lost your bounce, like you've spent too much time on the ground, you've probably acquired a compensatory position, and the pressure differential in your body is too low. It's been smushed down. The toothpaste tube has been squeezed down.
Yeah, the pressure's going down instead of up.
Yeah.
That's the intention. It is especially for people that have to produce high force and then leave the ground. So again, sprinters, jumpers, etc. Right? Yeah. We want somebody that can shift the pressure gradient in the other direction. This is why certain physical structures are more ideal. Like you watch the Olympics and it's like it doesn't matter what sport you're looking at. There are exceptions to the rule, but generally speaking, the sprinters tend to look the same. The 800-meter runners tend to look the same. The high jumpers tend to look the same. The weightlifters kind of look the same. Volleyball players look the same, right?
Yeah,
because they are utilizing their physical structures in a favorable way to create pressure gradients that allow them to do amazing things. You create the wrong gradient. You create the wrong gradient. So if I increase your pressure from the top and it goes down into the ground, you are now stuck to the ground, and then that's why you're an accountant and not a high jumper.
Yeah, you had the 4 types of skeletons in one of your articles on UHP, and I forget what one of the accountant was, but I do remember the accountant there pretty clearly.
The pylon.
The pylon. That's right, the pylon.
Yeah, near at the top, wide at the bottom.
Yeah,
a pylon can take a charge better than anybody else.
Yeah,
they are just stapled into the ground, man. They
are great positioners. They're great positioners, but tend to be inadequate leapers.
Yeah, it is funny. Now I think my brother he's like a year younger than me. Growing up, he was always so good at holding his ground in all our pickup basketball games, but he couldn't jump quite as high. But he was a soccer defender as well, and just. Not looking back, he's not like a super pylon, but he was definitely more of a pylon than I was, and I was more the funnel, like the inverted pylon, and the jump and the jumping. It's so interesting to think about where and how people's strengths are the way they were. But then for me as the funnel, the worst my vertical ever was, the least bounce I've had in my life was after I did a powerlifting program for 12 weeks. And I must have just squeezed the crap out of the top of myself. And so I think about squeezing the position of all the guts down, down, down. It's interesting to think about bounce on the level of where and how your pressure is kind of like, center of mass or
where your guts are going. It's a difference between if you could use an example of we were talking about using agility drills and pro agility stuff to increase performance for acceleration and short sprints. You could do something like bouncing on a springboard floor, running on a springboard floor, bouncing on a trampoline as something that would allow you to get the guts to come up, to get this sort of vertical dimension to display velocity. It's just that would be the opposite of that spectrum, because even even like Charlie Francis or like Derek Hansen will talk about like positive vertical hip displacement as like this predictor of velocity. And that's the ability to let your guts come up, like put forces down to let stuff go and float into the air, into ER.
Yeah, that's where oh, sorry, Bill, if you're going to say something.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I found something interesting because even with that, I didn't want to make this a huge rabbit trail, but just from the track background, I've never been a fan of just the quote having cues run tall, because usually when you try to run tall, it's a some sort of compensation.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Versus what's what's actually happening. And to me, even if you just inhale real big, you just feel like you're running taller. Just you displace something internally. It's like, oh, this is what this feels like. But to actually, there's a lot more structure that happens beneath the surface than just telling. Like if you told the accountant the pylon to run tall, it's easier said than done. Like there's a lot of things that need to happen.
This is always the concern between like the sport coach and then the physical preparation is the coach asking you to do something that is physically against your structure. Like we can improve a lot of things. Like we could take a pylon and we can get them to leave the ground better. We can't in most cases turn them into the greatest jumper. We can make them better because we understand what their physics are. And if we understand that, then we can select the appropriate activities that give them the best outcome in that circumstance. But if I just say run taller, and you don't have the physical capacity under any circumstance because you picked the wrong parents. But now if the sport coach goes to the prep coach and he says, hey, this guy's not leaving the ground very well. Now the prep coach goes, okay, we have strategies for this type of a person that will allow him to do this better, right? Versus just giving them a coaching cue and hoping that makes the correction. We have a physiological reason for the deficit. We have to address the physiology, but we have to understand the physiology first. And that's what we're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, ways to run lower and, or, to be more glued to the ground would be apply excessive top-down pressure, orientation up, top down, which would be why the weight room might get a bad rap. Hey, you did a lot of squeezing top down and you're not as bouncy anymore. Or prolonging IR or like internal rotation when you shouldn't be. Those things would make your gut sit lower and make you more not feel bouncy. What would be the opposite from a gut's perspective? I think we talked about already, like, and relative motions and things, but
you hit on this. So number one, we have to create a gradient of pressure internally. So the mistake in most circumstances is to create a squeeze from the top down. So this is overstrength training an athlete. So weight room numbers go up, force producing capabilities as demonstrated by something where they would have to leave the ground or end up like a baseball pitcher's throwing velocity, right? I can stick somebody into the ground harder by creating a top-down pressure gradient, which means that there is an expansion that is occurring at the lowest end of the axial skeleton that will hold you into the ground. What I need to be able to do is actually create the high pressure representation of the pelvis, which is going to be most of the internal rotation, which is a high force producing pelvis. However, I also have to be able to create the expansion superior to that so that when I do pressurize the pelvis, I actually go in the appropriate direction, which is actually away from the earth. And so this is what you were talking about before when you were talking about, hey, I tend to squat better when I don't go below parallel, and I'm emphasizing that late propulsive segment of the squat at the top. It's like, well, that's what we're talking about. The ability to produce the high pressure strategy, but then get the guts off of that. And so this becomes your more explosive activities, right? But you have to establish that foundation first, and then you have to eliminate the interference. And so the interference is if I increase the compression in the uppermost portion of the axial skeleton through whatever strategies that I'm using in the weight room to apply force, if I increase that to too great a degree, I've reversed the pressure gradient, right? And now I've created my own interference.
From a pressure perspective, you actually got me thinking, because for me, like I'm a narrow through and through, but I worked so hard my bench press was only long arms, but only got up to 240. I was like, but my overhead press, I got up to 170. I was all stoked, but I just can't help but think about like the upper back, like how that must have flattened and had to press and squeeze to get that overhead press. And then based off what we're saying, like, okay, if I want to get more air into the upper part of my abdominal cavity, I've also lost like, just the app laser, touch my hands behind my, if I'm like reaching behind my back and try to touch my fingers, I've lost about 2 or 3 inches, maybe 2 inches of touch in those 20 years of that, drive to get those presses up. But I think about just stuff that gets your, like an inversion, like where you're doing like an inversion drill and you're just trying to get air up into that upper thorax or dorsal rostral or, whatever the exact area is. I can't help but think, well, maybe that also would help to, if I really pressed myself to do things that expand that air, the chest, the front chest and the upper back, maybe I lose a few pounds on my bench, but if I'm getting more air, I imagine that could help the upward travel of that pressure system.
The goal is to help the athlete do what athletes do, not to turn them into the strongest guy in the weight room. Like there's no guarantee that if I continue to increase force production, that I'm doing something beneficial. There are secondary consequences to everything that you do. We just have to take those into consideration. We have to know what the potential consequences are versus just saying, oh, it's a muscle thing, or it's a force thing, right? Or it's a hypertrophy thing. We can't look at that with such a narrow scope. We have to understand, it's like, what am I actually doing to the ability of the skeleton to change its shape? What am I doing to the ability to put air into certain spaces that allow you to access relative motions that I might need for an event, right? If I'm creating interference to that, then, I'm the one that's creating the limitation, which is what I want to avoid in the first place.
Yeah. So just a couple of things to close out then, based off what we've been talking, especially too, we started talking about cutting and changing direction. So we should probably finish with something related to that.
It's all the same. Yeah. We can talk about anything because it's all the same.
All the same. It's okay. We did talk about cutting. We've been talking about the cutting this whole time.
Yeah. It's like into the cut, out of the cut is how you train a 6-year-old. It's how you train a 75-year-old woman. It's how you train a 45-year-old. It's how you train a 22-year-old defensive lineman. It's like, it's all
exactly.
Yeah.
It's all the same.
So just, last thing I actually did want to mention that, because it is all related. I did want to talk about something that is kind of like, I heard you mention this on the network. It was a split squat. I think it was an oscillatory. It's why you call it OI, oscillatory impulse. I've heard it oscillatory isometric in other terminology.
There's no such thing as an isometric, so we have to eliminate that from the vocabulary.
Yeah.
That's what it is. It's an impulse.
With the impulse, but basically going from a split squat, where you're at the end range, or close to, you're at maybe where it's around max P or somewhere, but kind of dropping down. And
yes,
so, but you had talked about, I think it was something to the tune of like the early stance or early representation is the same as the late, or there's similarities in there. I'd just be curious to clarify, because I found, I'll just say, just caveat, like I found that to be for like top end speed, things that can open up ranges for sprinting. That is a really phenomenal movement. And so, curious how to unpack that from the base of what you've been talking about.
Right, so to create a verbal picture, right? So take yourself to the bottom of the split squat, come up 2 inches, like do a free fall drop through that 2 inches, recatch the bottom of the split squat, and as quickly as possible return to the starting position. So we're talking about a very brief impulse, high force, very short period of time. Okay. In that circumstance, so in the initial descent is where the relative motion is going to exist. We actually lose ground contact. So this is actually kind of cool. You're losing ground contact as you're performing the oscillation, right? So I don't have any IR initially, which means that I have to acquire it within that short time frame. So I go from this ER predominant, early ER predominant. I start to load the IR on very quickly. I come to an immediate stop, and then I change direction. So I'm going through early, middle, and late through a very brief moment in time, which has a lot of transferability to activities where I do have these brief ground contact times, whether it be changes of direction, sprinting, or the like.
I love that. I think I probably heard it from the network or something somewhere. I think it was just a video you had done.
Yeah.
But it's like the idea of
Yeah.
compacting more things into less time and space.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So and again, you think about this and we kind of talked about this when we're talking about the increasing force production strength training in the weight room. It's like I have to take these things into consideration when I have athletes that don't have a lot of time to apply force to the ground. Take a narrow ISA baseball pitcher, right? They're stepping towards home plate. They have a very brief moment in time where they're going to apply a very high force into the ground. It's like if I take their force production up, but I've increased the duration of that impulse, I've now created the interference, which is what we're trying to avoid. So these oscillatory activities that do account for these brief moments in time become very, very useful in those circumstances because they're still high force. They're still very high force, in fact, but I'm also addressing the time constraint.
Yeah. That makes perfect sense. Yeah, especially too. Like a lot of times, the first thing that comes to mind is more and less times, like just like different like quick sprint drills that can put more force in the foot in less time in a certain situation. But here now we're just drawing out the gait cycle, split squat, and you can use. I just think it's really cool. So I think it's a good topic to finish on here.
Yeah.
Well, appreciate it, guys. I think that's about all we had for the day. Lots of really good stuff. And I know, I think you had something, or I think you guys may have had something to mention about the network or that there's something going on for the holidays. So be sure to talk about that.
Depending on when this comes out. But yeah, so the UHP network, the place where practitioners and people interested in Bill's model get together to learn about it. There is a free area, of course, and then there's a members area. So the members area, we're doing a promotion where you can get in there for free for 2 weeks. So you can see all the cool stuff that Joel's been talking about with us, the case studies and the different posts. And then we also have a training program called Recon. That's at reconu.co is the website for that. There's a promotion for $15 off of your first purchase with the code RECON15. And then the network address is uhp.network. So that's the long and the short of it.
Awesome. Yeah, it's been a lot of fun being on there myself. So yeah, definitely people listening, check that out. It's been really cool.
Glad you're enjoying it.
So, all right. Well, hey, thank you guys again so much, Chris and Bill. Appreciate you the time. Learned a ton. Always good talking to you. So thank you again.
It's great to talk to you, Joel.
Yeah. Thanks, Joel.
Thanks again for tuning in. One quick addendum to what Chris had mentioned there is that special, the free trial for UHP Plus will actually go till January 5th of 2025. Check that out, and I will see you all next week.